Hi guys, welcome back. This is part two of chapter 7, Climate and Vegetation, and we're going to take a very quick review here. We've had some of this material in class already, so this will be kind of a review for some of you, or if you missed that class, it'll be all new material. So here we go. So basically, we're moving on to the B climates. Remember, we talked about the A climates, the AF, the tropical wet, the AM, the tropical monsoon, and the AW, the tropical wet and dry or tropical savanna climate. Now we move on to the B climates. Now the B climates occupy a big chunk of the earth. About 30% of the land area is occupied by the B climates. There are two types, the desert, BW, so B means dry, W for desert, S for steppe. So we have the desert and the steppe. What do they have in common? They're pretty dry. Well, how do we define dry? They have a huge potential evapotranspiration. In other words, if we had a whole bunch of water there, a whole bunch of that water would evaporate away. But we don't have a whole lot of water there. So we don't have very much precipitation and therefore standing water. And we have an enormous amount of potential evapotranspiration. So this is what defines the B climates. Huge potential for evapotranspiration, very little in the way of precipitation. So we have a water deficit. Okay, moving on. Let's look at the locations. So the dark brown color represents a location of the world's steppe climates. And if you notice, there is a pattern here. So the dark brown, the steppes, and the lighter brown, the deserts. So here's desert, here's the steppes of North Africa. Here's desert, and here we see the steppe. Desert, steppe, desert, steppe, desert, steppe, desert, steppe. So you can clearly see the pattern here, right? The steppe climates surround the desert climates. These are both dry climates, but the driest of them are the deserts. And as you move away out of the desert, it becomes progressively more moist. Still dry, but a lot more moisture in these areas surrounding the desert than it is in the heart of the desert. And that's important because once you get over about 11 inches of rainfall or so per year, we start to see a preponderance of grasses grow. So when we get to the point where there's enough moisture for grasses to grow, we typically say we're out of the desert and into the steppe. Of course, we don't measure it directly that way. It's measured through precipitation gauges and the likes. Calculations are made, but that's kind of the secret giveaway there. Once the grasses become the dominant form of vegetation, the natural vegetation anyway, we're more than likely into the steppe climate. So we basically see that these areas are dominated by the presence of the subtropical high pressure zone. Now that means that we're going to find most of the world's deserts, most of them, that is, around 20 to 30 degrees latitude, both northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. So the Sonoran Chihuahua Desert, the Sahara Desert, the Atacama Desert of South America, the Namib Desert of Southern Africa, and the Great Sandy Desert and Victoria Desert of Australia. So again, dominated by the subtropical high pressure zone. Now these pressure zones do tend to break down over land a little bit. So we can't see a continuous stretch, but we get a pretty good idea here. Over the land, around 20 to 30 degrees is a great chance of getting our desert environments. We can also see in the mid latitudes we get some deserts out of the areas where they're supposed to be, and that's usually because of mountain barriers, like in the case of the Gobi Desert, or very, very, very far away from storm tracks and water bodies. So distance from a large water body becomes a predominant reason also. So those B climates, again, deserts and steppe. So the driest of these would be the desert, and this is a desert in winter, desert in summer, or probably most of the year. And by the way, most deserts look like this. There is vegetation growing in the desert. Very little of the deserts actually look like these sand seas, or sometimes called ergs. These are just accumulations of sand from particles being picked up by the wind and then deposited as the wind changes its speed, or as different winds hit each other, making the wind speed drop and the load of sand and silt gets deposited. On the other hand, this is an area of steppe grassland, as is this. I better check myself out of here so you can see better. But basically, here we go. Grasses and grasses. Still dry, but enough moisture for the grasses to grow. Therefore, those would be steppe climate types. Now, when we're looking at the desert and the steppe, there's two different ways of assessing these, because we have subtropical desert, subtropical steppe, we have mid-latitude desert, mid-latitude steppe. And one way we can look at this is by dividing up and saying, well, let's look at the subtropical varieties of both, look at where they are, little characteristics of them. And another way to do it is to look at deserts, both mid-latitude and subtropical, and then look at steppe, both mid-latitude and the subtropical. So the two differences come about that in this case, we're going to look at deserts themselves, just deserts, hold off on the steppe. So we have deserts that are hot, deserts that are cold. Now, what that really refers to is the annual temperature, the average annual temperature being what we consider to be continuously warm to hot, or those that might have a cold or cold snap winter. So basically, the mid-latitude deserts have the propensity to be much colder in the winter than are the deserts of the subtropics. So subtropical deserts, those are the ones that really are found around 20 to 30 degrees latitude. We refer to those as hot deserts or subtropical deserts. And then the mid-latitude deserts, the ones that are a little bit out of the way from where they would normally be found, were it not for mountain ranges blocking the moisture, or possibly a large distance from a water body, or way out of the track of storms. So these typically found in inland locations in the mid-latitudes. And in the wintertime, those can get pretty cold. So again, BWH, the hot deserts, generally are found 20 to 30 degrees latitude, northern and southern hemisphere, associated with the subtropical high pressure zone. The BWK, the cold deserts, the mid-latitude deserts, those are going to be in the interiors of continents, rain shadows of mountains, etc. Both of them are pretty hot in the summer, but the BWK, the mid-latitude deserts, get pretty cold in the winter. Annual temperature ranges for BWH, the hot deserts, substantially high, 30 degrees Fahrenheit or so, average difference between winter and summer temperatures. But when we get into the cold deserts, think Mojave Desert, think of Palmdale, Lancaster. In this case, we're looking at deserts that can be pretty darn hot in the summertime, but really cool off, even to freezing temperatures in the wintertime. So basically, we're looking at annual temperature ranges over 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In fact, some of these desert environments, the air is so dry that we can see enormous changes, not just from winter to summer, but from morning to afternoon. So the daily temperature ranges can be exorbitant in some of these deserts, be it hot deserts or cold deserts. Now, the hot deserts, in fact, are so dry that you could get temperatures of 125 degrees Fahrenheit one afternoon, and it be approaching freezing the following morning. So you got to be careful in deserts. You can bake to death, you can freeze to death. And what's the key to that? There's very little moisture in the air, and when there's no moisture in the air, temperatures can go all kinds of crazy, from the afternoon to the morning, or from winter to summer. Underlined here, we see the largest daily temperature ranges in the world. Those are for the subtropical deserts. Keep that in mind. Anything underlined on these presentations, there might be a question about that a little bit later on. Now for both subtropical deserts and mid-latitude deserts, and I'm rounding this off quite a bit, but just to give you a general idea, if you're looking at under 11 inches of rainfall per year, and you're in those subtropical latitudes or very close to them, you're going to be a desert. So you're either going to be a hot desert or a cold desert, depending on your specific circumstances. Now, the rainfall might average, let's say for a desert locally, maybe Lancaster, 7 inches of rainfall per year, let's say, might be an average amount of rainfall. That's certainly under 11 inches. Now, it doesn't mean that every year is going to get about 7 inches. There might be some years that get 2 inches, 3 inches, maybe even less. Some years might get 15 inches. You just have no guarantees from year to year. And that's one thing about the deserts. Highly variable from year to year how much moisture you get. Now, the one thing I do want you to know is which biome is associated with each climate zone. In this case, it's pretty easy. Desert climate, desert biome. We're going to explore that. Second. First of all, a climograph. Cairo, Egypt, sounds like a desert, right? Well, it is a desert. It's a city built on a desert. Luckily, the Nile River flows from the south northwards towards the Mediterranean, and Cairo can take advantage of that water flowing by. But if we look at Cairo, Egypt, temperatures in degrees Fahrenheit, averaging July, averaging about 80, 84 degrees, something in that range there. So that means that maybe in the morning temperature it's cooled off to 70, but in the afternoons it's probably gotten up to close to 100, if not beyond. So some pretty hot afternoon temperatures are not cooling down that much. Remember, in summertime, the sun stays up longer, it's at a higher angle. That really heats things up, and there's not a whole lot of time to cool down. So hot desert, Cairo, Egypt. Look at rainfall. January, not much. February, not much. March, not much. April, May, June, July, August, September, October, nothing. November, December, catching the tail end of some of those wintertime storms moving through the northern hemisphere. So total precipitation, just a few inches per year, and significant difference between summer and wintertime temperatures. That's probably about, let's see, 58 to 84, maybe in the mid-20s, 26, 27, 28 degrees Fahrenheit annual temperature range, something along those lines. If you looked at Egypt, if you've been to Egypt, especially in the Giza Plateau, just outside of Cairo, where the Great Pyramids are located, is very much a desert environment. I was lucky enough one day to go by camel from these pyramids to the ancient pyramids of Saqqara, and that was across the desert for a few hours on a camel. And I will never ride a camel again in my life. I was wearing shorts and camel hair just do not mix well together. Phoenix, Arizona is also a desert, but this is a cold desert. So look at the temperatures in Phoenix, averaging probably about 55 degrees Fahrenheit in the January, December time period. So around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep in mind that might mean temperatures in the early mornings in the 30s and maybe even below, and in the afternoon still heating up maybe to the 70s. Rainfall, not a whole lot. This is in inches of precipitation. Here's 1 inch of precipitation. So it really doesn't get much above that in any single month. But for Phoenix, Arizona, maybe 1, 2, 3, that might add up to another one, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 or 9 inches of total rainfall in a year. It seems to be pretty spread out evenly, but April, May, and June, not much at all. So you're probably getting a little bit of winter precipitation from those storms coming through the mid-latitudes, drying off a little bit as the Rossby waves kind of die down, and then picking up some afternoon thunderstorms in the middle of summertime. So the desert kind of looks like this. Now remember, we're looking at the climate right now. So that means we're looking at air. Well, you can't see air, right? So you're looking through the air. Well, this is what you see when you look through the air. You see the landscape. So the landscape will give us a little bit of an idea about, or tell us a little bit of kind of like a clue of what the environment is doing, what the climate is doing. In fact, I think if you looked at this, you would say, that looks pretty darn dry. And these kind of cactus, these saguaro cactus, they're giving it away that, yeah, this is indeed a pretty dry area. More about that to come. A little bit more close to home. This is in the southern portion of Joshua Tree National Park. This is just off of Highway 10 as you make your way from Palm Springs, Indio, Coachella, but on the north side of the highway, if you go into Joshua Tree National Park, you can see a landscape like this. Lots of bare ground. These are cactus, like a cholla cactus in there. A lot of bare ground in between them here. And that's partly because the roots spread shallowly under the ground here, and they'll interconnect with each other at some distance. And they're telling each other, hey, don't get too close, I'm already here. Pretty typical for desert vegetation. Talking about vegetation, we just looked at the desert climate type, and the biome associated with that is the desert biome. So desert climate, desert biome. This is what you find in the BW climates, both BWK and BWH. So examples of the desert biome would be found in the Sahara, the Gobi, the Mojave, the Sonora, Atacama, and Namib deserts, as I pointed out earlier. And one thing about the vegetation in deserts is it's typically referred to as xerophytic. This means drought resistant. So yes, plants can adapt to these environments by having certain adaptations. We'll talk about those a little bit more in detail, but basically it makes sense. If you went to the desert and you're going to be there for a few days, you'll probably take some chapstick with you. You put that on your lips, so you put a waxy layer on your lips. It keeps the moisture inside. Well, plants have adapted to do the same thing. They develop waxy leaves. They develop spines and thorns, which are basically just adaptations of leaves. So it makes the leaves really small, but also pointy, so that maybe animals that were thirsty will not come and take moisture from that plant by taking a big bite out of it. The smaller the leaf, the better, because that means less transpiration. Also taking advantage of tap roots, which means the root system has one particular root that's going straight down, as deep as it can go. Well, what's down there? The groundwater. So it wants to tap into that groundwater. If you can find it, that plant will survive a little bit better. Some of these plants will have extensive roots. Extensive means it goes out a long way. So basically, spread your roots out, shallow, a few inches below the surface, spread them out. When it does rain, you can suck all that moisture back in. Also, if you can't make your leaves waxy, make them leathery. That's another way of keeping the moisture inside. These are all adaptations for plants that we see in the desert, referred to as xerophytic adaptations, that allow plants to live for, to tell you the truth, more than 1 year. So we call these perennial adaptations. Perennial means more than a year. Another type of adaptation, a unique type, is what we see in the annual plants. Well, annuals mean they only live for one season. So what these annual plants are going to do is wait for the rains. Now the rains come. Now the seeds are going to germinate. They're going to grow. They're going to develop flowers and seeds. They're going to drop the seeds, and they're going to die off, all in a matter of weeks. Well, what's the advantage there? You're carrying your seeds on to the next generation. That's the adaptation of an annual plant. Now, we have many examples in our local deserts, like creosote bush, different types of cacti, ocotillo and yucca. We see a lot of those in the local desert, especially out by Joshua Tree National Park, where we also have Joshua trees. And by the way, the southern portion of Joshua Tree National Park doesn't have Joshua trees. The northern portion does. It needs to be a little bit higher elevation and therefore a little bit colder. Coyote bush, salt bush, these are plants that don't look very pretty to most people, but for nature, it's a beautiful way of surviving. So we have to appreciate any plant that can survive in an area with just a few inches of rainfall per year and keep on living. We got to appreciate that. Now, what about the animals? If you're driven through the desert during the daytime, you don't see very many animals. But if you are out there at nighttime, that's when they're out. They're pretty smart. The animals are going to conserve their energy during the hot daytime, sunny or bright sunny days. They're going to be on the ground, under bushes, somewhere where they're not going to bake. And then at nighttime, when it gets really cold, out they come. So lots of nocturnal animals in the desert, including snakes and lizards and things like porcupine and coyote and mountain lion, all kinds of stuff. Goats. So in our local deserts, we've got all kinds of animals, but you rarely see them unless you're there at nighttime. Even then, they're pretty hard to see. So again, the biome we're looking at here is the desert biome, and it's found in exactly the same place that we see the desert climate types. So where we pointed out deserts before in terms of climate, we're going to see that associated biome with that also, including our own backyard over here. So again, desert survival strategies or xerophytic adaptations. So small waxy leaves, thorns instead of leaves. Succulents is interesting. That's kind of like, think about a cucumber. If you cut into a cucumber, you see all those little spongy cells inside where it's all kind of wet. That's where the gooey stuff is. Many succulents have that very same type of waxy outer structure with these areas of moisture inside. Those deep tap roots going way down towards the water table. Plants being spaced pretty wide, basically so they're not competing for the same space with another plant, but also gathering the water while they can. And we also have those annuals with their own strategies. We'll look at these again. So again, we've got waxy outer skin, long roots to tap into the water, and some of those with a taproot, believe it or not, some of them can be over 100 feet down. They can grow 100 feet down, and that's more advantageous than growing up. If sunlight is not the thing you're competing for as much, the water is the thing you're competing for. The one to get the water is going to be the one that has a better chance of survival. So I have thorns and prickles on there so things don't eat you. Some develop little structures on the ground to hold that water. Remember, it's going to be a lot harder for the sun to evaporate away that moisture if it's hidden from the direct sunlight. So saguaro cactus like this over here, very extensive roots. Palo Verde, another type of desert plant, very deep roots. Mesquite, these are ones that could be 100. I've heard at some points maybe approaching 120, 150 feet. I'm not sure if that's been measured. I wonder how deep they can actually go and dig to measure those roots, but very, very deep, that's for sure. And saguaro, again, extensive roots to collect that water, suck it up, and hold on to it after the rains. So again, if you're an animal, you're quite thirsty, you notice some moisture inside this cactus here, you're not going to go bite that sucker, no way. If you are a plant with leaves, small leaves means less transpiration. A little bit more to it than that. The little holes or the stomata from which transpiration will take place are pretty small and less numerous than desert plants for that very reason. That also means that desert plants tend to grow a little bit more slowly than others do. And that succulent adaptation here where you have that little water storage cells within the plant. These are all good ways to survive if you are adapted to the desert. So annual strategy here, you got a seed, the water and the rains come, you grow, flower, also develop your seeds, drop the seeds, die, and the cycle goes again. It could be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years sometimes between enough rain of some of these seeds to be able to germinate, but they stay there. There are stories sometimes of decades or longer where seeds are still productive. They just haven't had the right message being sent by the moisture to say, hey, there's enough moisture here to start growing. So they can be in the soil for a very long time before they germinate. This is what most of us picture a desert environment to look like. There is vegetation there. But then when the rains come, ba-boom, look at all those seeds that have gotten the message, time to grow. They grow up, they go to flower. The next thing will be the seeds. Then those things will wither and die away. It can be a beautiful landscape right after the rainfall, including these poppies from the California Poppy Reserve up by Gorman. Okay, now we're into the steppe climates. So the subtropical steppe, the BSH, and the mid-latitude steppe, the BSK. So B, dry, S, steppe, H means hot or subtropical, K means cold or mid-latitude. So these are the areas that are surrounding those BWH and BWK deserts. And that's because they're getting more than 11 inches of rainfall now, and that's enough for the grasses to start growing abundantly. Temperatures are pretty much the same as we see in the deserts, so very similar to hot deserts and to cold deserts. Highly variable year-to-year moisture, that 11 to 30 inches or 11 to 20 inches in the mid-latitudes are enough for those grasses to grow, but not every year we'll see abundant rainfall. Again, low in some years, high in some, but in other years, but averaging around or over 11 inches. Now, what we're going to see here is in the tropics, in the subtropics, the BSH, the subtropical steppe, we're going to get savanna grasslands growing. So this is enough for grasses to grow, and the tropical grasslands or subtropical grasslands are referred to as savanna grasslands. So that's part of a biome called the tropical woodland scrub and savanna. So tropical means it's between 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south latitude, typically. Can be a little bit beyond that. The woodland means trees where the branches and the leaves are not touching from one tree to the next, so there's space between them. The scrub or shrub means basically bushes occupying that space, and S, savanna. So we've got scattered trees, bushes, and grasslands. And that makes sense because if the trees are not connected to each other, they're not stealing all the sunlight. The trees are not gobbling up all that sunlight. There's space between them. Sunlight can now hit the ground, and on the ground, we're going to see bushes and grasses grow. So within these areas, sometimes you'll see people just say savanna representing just grasses, and sometimes they refer to savanna as scattered trees with bushes and grasses growing in between them. Now, within that environment, between the trees, grasses seem to predominate. And one of the reasons for that is that for thousands of years, humans have set fire to these environments. Because if you set fire to a tropical woodland, scrub, and savanna, the trees get scorched a little bit, but they don't die off. The bushes, the shrubs, the scrub gets burned away. The grasses get burned away, but from all that ash, the grasses, next time it rains, the grasses are going to grow very quickly, and there's lots of energy in the grains at the end of the grass. And that's going to bring wildlife in or allow you to graze your cattle. So in many areas of the world where we see grasses predominate, it's usually because fire has been involved, either natural or human-made fires, to, over time, make the grasses more abundant than what they would otherwise be. So again, if you see the word savanna, or you see the words tropical woodland, scrub, and savanna, we're seeing woodland. Woodland means trees that are spread apart. Scrub, or shrubs, the bushes, and savanna, the tropical grasses. And that's what you get in the BSH climate type. You get the tropical woodland, scrub, and savanna. And by the way, on the wetter parts, more woodland. On the drier parts, less woodland, more grasses. Now, the BSK, the cold steppe, is associated with mid-latitude grasslands. Well, go figure, right? You got mid-latitude deserts, you're going to get mid-latitude grasslands. Still a grassland, still aided by fire, but in this case, we use different words. We don't use the word savanna. We would instead say prairie, steppe, pampas, veldt, depending on which region you're in. For the North Americans, we would use the word prairie for the taller grasses and steppe for the shorter grass species. So these would tend to, the steppe grasses would tend to be on the drier portions of the mid-latitude grassland biome, and the prairie grasses would be towards the areas where the grasses would grow taller, usually because there's more rainfall there. So BSH, hot steppe or subtropical steppe, an example would be Monterrey, Mexico. Now we're looking at precipitation in millimeters. Well, every 25 millimeters is an inch of rain. So let's look over in this area here. Well, here, 1 inch of rain, a little over an inch, a little below an inch, a little over an inch, maybe 1.5 inches. When we get to 50, that's 2 inches. So a little bit more as we get into June, July, August, September. And that's northern hemisphere, so we're getting summertime rains here, and then falling off again into the fall, into the winter. Overall, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, add 6, 19, maybe 23. We're approaching maybe 25 inches of rainfall or so, maybe around that area. Temperatures, January, December minimums to be expected in the northern hemisphere, maximum around July. And the maximum temperature in July, we're looking at about, this is the average temperature now, maybe 28 degrees Celsius. That's low 80s on average. And minimum, we're looking at about 15 degrees. So 15 degrees Celsius, that is around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty mild winters and pretty warm, even hot summers. And this is what the environment would look like. So again, the natural environment would be grasslands in a pretty dry area. And we see some trees, some bushes, and grasses. So bushes, trees, grasses. The trees spread apart, that's a woodland. The bushes is a scrub or shrub. And we've got the grassland here. In Africa, in tropical portions of Africa, in the BSH climate zone, we would get those savanna grasslands. But again, scattered trees, some bushes, and predominant grasses. And a big chunk of this area is burned every single year, so the grasses become dominant. And as the grasses grow, by the way, the wildebeest and the zebra are going to migrate back and forth, north of the equator, south of the equator, north of the equator, south of the equator, following the rainy seasons and following the growth of the grasses. Denver, Colorado would be BSK, so a steppe grassland that's considered cold, so cold steppe or mid-latitude steppe. Significant changes from season to season, from winter to summer in terms of temperature. Well, let's say rainfall, this is now back to inches. Let's say about average of about 1.5 per month, so maybe about 18 or 20 inches of rainfall each year. And Denver, if I had a picture of it, would have shown the grasslands. I think I got a picture of that coming up. But the mid-latitude, by the way, if you see that word temperate, that means mid-latitude. So mid-latitude grasslands associated with the BSK climates. We're looking at, again, prairie, pampa, veldt. So prairie, long grass, North America. Pampa, South American grasslands. Veldt, South African grasslands. And steppe, shorter grasslands, North America. So we're looking at the edge of the desert, so just enough, just wetter than the desert, basically enough for grasses to grow. And fire is important for the maintenance of the grasses. Now the soils are actually very, very fertile in all these areas, and that dates back to a legacy of our glacial periods, with the winds blowing in front of the glacial debris, blowing back and forth and making very thick accumulations of very productive soil. So a lot of these grassland areas have grown or adapted to being on very fertile soils. Since ages of colonization, we see a lot of European grasses like wheat or rye, barley, displacing the natural grasses. We also see that for thousands of years, these natural grasses would have been available for browsing herbivores like deer and antelope and bison. And we have since killed off an awful lot of those, and we've instead put cattle, sometimes sheep, onto those same areas. And we're doing that form of agriculture instead. So BSK, Colorado, this would be a shorter grassland here. So you can't do too much agriculturally here unless you bring a lot of water in, or you can have your cattle go out there, graze, and fatten them up and try and make some money that way. So our mid-latitude grasslands are these lighter colors here. So we can see it extends in the the western states and into the Great Plains and actually into Canada too. So these are areas where we would now grow a lot of our wheat and barley, corn in some areas. We also get quite a bit of Central Asia. There are areas of South America, Argentina and Uruguay. And there are areas around the world, a little tiny bit over here, where we get very productive soils, and those grasslands, again, if they're natural, they're going to do very well by themselves, but we've displaced those with other crops. Even in Utah, very short grasses here. This is short grass steppe, or some people just refer to that as short grass prairie, but different species from most prairie grasses. And the natural longer grasses, these prairie grasses, this would have been what the bison, the herds of hundreds of thousands of bison would have been grazing on prior to the 1800s, or prior to the 1900s. Okay, out of the B climates into the C climates. So with those C climates, we have to realize there are 3 distinct sea climates, and we'll look at the associated biomes for each. This actually includes our own backyard environment too. So we are, that's us in California, or coastal California, we have a climate type known as the Mediterranean climate. If you're on the southeast corner of the United States, let's say Florida, the Carolinas, etc., humid subtropical. And those folks up by Northern California, with the coast, all the way up through Oregon and Washington, marine west coast. So these are 3 C climates that we have in the United States. Let's go look at where else in the world we have. So again, the Mediterranean climate, CSA, we get along the coast of California. We get along the borders of the Mediterranean. That's where the name comes from. So the coastal areas across the Mediterranean. A little strip down here of South America out by Santiago in Chile. The southernmost tip of South Africa by Cape Town. And southern tip of Western Australia out by the city of Perth and Margaret River. And also by South Australia by Adelaide. So these are the places where we get Mediterranean climates. The humid subtropical southeast portions of continents, so the southeast corner of the United States, the southeast corner of Eurasia, including over here by, let's say, Hong Kong and into China, a little bit of Australia's east coast over here, probably from Sydney north up and towards Cairns, a little tiny bit of South Africa over here, maybe towards Durban, and South America, parts of Argentina into Uruguay and beyond. So those are the humid subtropical. And again, humid, guess what it's going to be there? Quite humid. And then lastly, we have this yellow color. This is referred to as marine west coast. We get that from Northern California all the way up along the coast of Oregon, Washington into British Columbia. The westernmost portion of Europe, and including northern Spain, the coast of France, most of the British Isles and Ireland and Norway. We also get little bits towards the southern east, southeastern portion of Australia, including Tasmania down here. New Zealand, one of my favorite places in the world, just a fantastic place. You got to go visit there one of these days. And also the southern portion of South America out by Punta Arenas in Chile. So that's the geography of those sea climates. They're all going to be mid-latitude, tending to be 30 to 45 degrees. But as you can see, especially for the marine west coast, it can extend way further than that if all the conditions are right. So the first one we'll look at is the Mediterranean, the CSA and CSB. So C, lower mid-latitudes. S, the summer is dry in both of these. A, the summers are bloody hot. So that would be like Glendale, or Cal State LA, Pasadena, or CSB. B means the summers are not quite as hot, and those we're going to find along the coast in Southern California, like not along the coast, but pretty much at the coast. So think about Santa Monica, Redondo Beach, maybe Santa Barbara. So I like that, UCSB. So Santa Barbara would be a CSB climate. The summer temperatures just don't get as high because the moisture in the air from the coast is not allowing the temperatures to heat up quite as much. But that effect only lasts a few miles inland before it dissipates and becomes a CSA climate. So these are all coastal portions of CSA and CSB, coastal portions of California, Spain, Chile, Portugal, etc., southernmost portion of South Africa, portions of South Australia, West Australia, all along the coast. And these are interesting because in all cases, they are under the influence of the subtropical high pressure zone in the summertime, giving us that sinking air, clear skies when the sun is pretty overhead, or pretty much overhead, and really heats up. So you think about a summer in Madrid, a summer in Barcelona, a summer in San Diego, a summer in Los Angeles. Pretty darn hot and dry because of that sinking air. On the other hand, they are under the influence of the westerlies in the wintertime. And remember, the westerlies is where we get those winter storms or mid-latitude extratropical wave cyclones caught up in the westerlies, moving from west to east. So that's what's bringing our storms. So those will hit all these places in their respective winter times, whereas all of them will have these dry conditions during the summertime. Total rainfall throughout the year, somewhere between 11 and 25 inches of rainfall. If we were any drier, we'd be deserts. But we're not, so we're not a desert. We're a Mediterranean climate. So again, pretty warm to hot in the summer, pretty mild winters. And that difference between the CSA and the CSB, one's at the coast and one is near the coast. There's a big difference between being at the coast and being near the coast in climate, as well as the cost of real estate, as you well know. Now, the biome associated with the Mediterranean climate type is the Mediterranean biome. So this is a very typical landscape we find in the Mediterranean climate zone. And this develops because in this case, Los Angeles, pretty decent difference between summer and wintertime temperatures, but the summers are pretty warm, if not hot. This is listed as a CSB, so not quite as hot as a CSA, but basically that's right when the dry conditions occur. So it is hot when it is dry, and it is mild when it is wet. That means that the plants that survive when it's mild and wet also have to be able to survive when it is hot and dry. And that's quite an ask when the last rains of May won't be followed up until probably October at the earliest, maybe November or December. That's a long time to stay without a drink of water if you're a plant. So we see different ways of plants surviving an environment like this. So this probably looks familiar. This is in the LA area. This is what it looks like much of the time, especially during the summertime. We got pretty much clear skies. The sun is out, warms up pretty good. Pretty hot summer days. We've seen it like this in the winter though. So those rains come when those mid-latitude extratropical wave cyclones roll through, whenever Rossby waves have gone crazy and given us one of these wintertime storms, but they roll through it and they roll out too. Sometimes we get a few of these a year. Sometimes we get a number of these, a lot of storms in a year. This is what it looks like after the rains. Beautiful Glendale. Those plants, they got to rely on, if they're going to survive, they got to find a way to gobble that water up, not let it out until the rains come again. So most of the plants are referred to as broadleaf evergreen sclerophyll plants, and this kind of means leathery leaves. So much like desert plants, we find in the Mediterranean that plants have to adapt to this seasonal, long 6 or 8 months of no moisture. Now, biomes, these huge ecosystems, can be subdivided into smaller communities. And there are 3 main communities making up the Mediterranean biome. The one that's close to Glendale College is referred to as a chaparral community. The one over by Santa Monica, or the natural vegetation of Santa Monica, is called the coastal sage scrub. Here the plants are a little bit softer, they're not as hard. And then we also have oak woodland. And again, woodland, that means trees that are spread apart, and therefore there's bushes and grasses in between them. In this case, the trees would be oak trees. So coast live oak, valley oak, scrub oak, depending on the specific location. In all cases here, we see that the sclerophyll plants tend to be hard and leathery, and that's a way of reducing the moisture loss. So you can catch the moisture, grab the moisture during those moist winters and hold on to it throughout that hot, dry summer. Now, in springtime, during and after the rains, that's when we see most of our plants bloom, and they get pretty dry after that. So the winter time is when the rains come, and the summertime, watch out, hot and dry. But still we have lots of plants in our own backyard that have survived this for eons. They found a way to survive. And some of those plants include sage, like black sage, purple sage, ceanothus, also known as California lilac, toyon. Those have brilliant red berries on them that come around Christmas time, so they call it sometimes called Christmas berry. Chamise or greasewood is a very successful plant because that poisons other plants. It actually develops a toxin and puts that into the soil so other plants die off around it. So it can become the dominant plant. Different types of oak trees in our local environment, including scrub oak. Again, black sage, California buckwheat. These are some of the plants we see on our local mountains. And if we ever did a hike, if we had our lab field trips, we would be able to point some of these out. In all cases, to preserve the natural environment, fire is needed about every 15 to 30 years to clear out all the poisons from the chamise, to clear out all the broken and fallen logs and twigs, etc., that make up a layer called the duff layer in the soil. So all that stuff has to burn away. Otherwise, plants like chamise become the dominant plant in our local environment, and the other plants, they become less so or less prevalent. And that means less wildlife coming in, less productivity of the plants. So every 15 to 30 years, if fire burns through, we get rejuvenation and the whole system is maintained. The problem is we built houses into those same hillsides. So we put the flames out every time they start coming. But if we keep doing that and chamise builds up, it's a very greasy plant and it's going to produce a very hot fire that we can't put out. So we got to be careful with that. Again, the biomes, the Mediterranean biome found in the same places as the Mediterranean climate type. So this is kind of like off purple color that we've seen in the same Mediterranean climate location. This doesn't necessarily look that pretty, but this is a pretty plant found in our local environment. Small leaves. There is still quite a bit of ground space with not very much going on, but this plant has found a very nice way to survive those hot, dry summers. So some typical chaparral plants. This is toyon with those Christmas berries on there. Scrub oak is basically an oak tree that's dwarfed a little bit. So the tree is smaller. There's an advantage of being smaller, less transpiration, less water need, etc. But we see full-size acorns on these scrub oaks. So basically we know this is in the oak family, the Quercus genus. And part of that is because this is one of the giveaways right here. Leathery leaves on sugarbush. So those very leathery, almost waxy-like leaves, and the same on laurel sumac. So these are some of the characteristics that we would see in the chaparral in particular. This is the chamise plant we talked about. This plant here has quite a bit of grease content or oil content within the very small leaves. The leaves are almost like Christmas tree, needly leaves on here. Not so nutritious, but basically this becomes a dominant plant if allowed to be dominant because it will poison other plants away. The second community is the oak woodland community. So again, oak trees with grasses and usually bushes in between them. Fire here is probably taking out the bushes, and the grasses are the first things to grow back. And then the third community is coastal sage scrub. So this looks like chaparral, but it's usually a little bit shorter, and the plants tend to be, or the leaves tend to be a little bit less hard, a little bit softer. Now you don't need to know all three communities, but you probably need to know that for every biome we're looking at, there are communities that are a little bit different from one another that we group together into a unit that we refer to as a biome. So just a very large ecosystem, and we tend to just generalize almost to the point of fault, but it's enough to allow us to make sense of all of this. Okay, our second C climate is the humid subtropical. So CWA, CFA, so this is lower mid latitudes. This one has a bit of a winter drought, but the summers are pretty damn hot. And CFA, lower mid latitudes, wet throughout the year, and the summers are pretty dang hot. Now, not only are they hot, they're hot and humid. So think about the southeast corner of the United States in particular. And we're looking at Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, even places like Kentucky, Mississippi. These are hot, sticky places. And if you've ever been there during summertime, you know what I'm talking about. And the same can be said of places like China, Guangzhou, and other regions in southeast China. The northern portions of India, which are excessively humid during the summertime, or the northeastern portion of Australia. So from Cairns, Australia, up north into Arnhem Land. These areas get 40 to 60 inches of rainfall per year, in part because they only have a very small dry season, if at all. That's about 2 to 3 times the amount of rainfall we get here in Southern California, especially by Glendale. Now, this is underlined. These climate types are influenced by warm ocean currents. So you imagine the southeast portion of the United States, those warm ocean currents coming across the Atlantic and then moving up along the coastline by Florida. That's pumping moist, warm, moisture into the air, and that air, that warm, humid air, is going to find its way into the continent, into the southeast portion of the continent, because as the continent warms up, the air warms up, the air rises, and it's going to pull that warm, moist air in. That's going to rise in the afternoon and give us some afternoon thunderstorms, and pretty heavy rain. So if you've ever been in the southeast portion of the United States during the summertime, you know that's a pretty thundery, lightning type of time. The good thing about that rainfall, though, that afternoon rainfall, it cools things off because it's excessively humid and miserable before that. And if you don't have air conditioning, you just can't sleep in the summertime there. It's just too hot, too sticky. Now, in the wintertime, they do get the tail end of those frontal winter rainstorms that come by in the westerlies, but most of their rainfall is probably going to be coming in that summertime. Their associated biome is called the temperate mixed forest biome. So you think of the southeast of the United States, and we'll look in a second, but basically think of the natural landscape, lots of trees around. I'm not talking about the areas of woodland, of wetlands like the Everglades, but the areas where we have soil above water level, and there's lots and lots and lots of trees out there. Pine trees in particular can grow like crazy. We'll talk about that in just a second. So humid subtropical, again, these are some of that landscape that we'd see, right? Lots of trees out there. But that's a mixed forest. As far as temperature regimes, now look at this. This is for Sydney, Australia, even though this picture over here is for the southeast portion of the United States. We're seeing here temperatures. Look at the temperature. It's getting its lowest temperature in June, July, August. Well, that makes sense, right? Sydney, Australia is in the southern hemisphere. Warmest temperatures are around January, maybe December, but January to February, very warm temperatures. If you've ever been to Sydney, Australia, and you've been there during their summer, maybe when the Australian Open tennis tournament is going on, they're going to have some days rained out because that's a wet time. But when is it not a wet time in Sydney, Australia? Every single month is getting a few inches of rainfall. Well, that's because it's wet throughout the year. Lower mid-latitudes, wet all year. Pretty hot summers. So if you go to Australia, January, February, if you go to Sydney, Australia, January, February, March, it is hot and wet. If you go to Sydney, Australia in July, yes, they're getting some wintertime storms, but the temperatures are much more mild. That's my favorite time to be in Sydney. Some nice warm days and the storm comes through, it gets chilly, big storms, then it clears up, warms up again. Great time to be there and a much less cost for accommodation, activities, and airfare. So think about that if you go to Sydney. Maybe it's a good time to go during Northern Hemisphere summer, Southern Hemisphere winter. So the temperate mixed forest, it's our first introduction to it. We're going to see this a lot because many climate types have the temperate mixed forest as their biome. Well, temperate, again, means mid-latitude. Mixed means a mix. A mix of what? Well, it's a mix of deciduous trees and evergreen trees. So whenever we see the temperate mixed forest, we're going to have some trees that keep their leaves throughout the year. They'll drop some and grow some at the same time. So those are evergreens. We're also going to see some trees that drop their leaves in this case, in the wintertime, when it gets a little cold. So they'll drop most of their leaves, if not all of their leaves. So if they drop the leaves, that's called deciduous. If a tree drops most of its, if it drops some of its leaves, that would be called semi-deciduous. But when it drops all the leaves, deciduous. Evergreen, keeping leaves throughout the year. Well, in the mixed forest, you got both. You've got some trees that are deciduous and some trees that are evergreen. Now, there are regional differences. For instance, in the northeast portion of the USA and much of Western Europe, we see most of the trees being deciduous. So think of England. Think of New England. In these cases, we see a lot of trees losing their leaves as we get into November, or maybe October, November, and December. On the other hand, if you look at the Northern California coast, all the way up through British Columbia, Alaska, etc., or the southeast portion of the United States, you're going to see these mixed forests dominated by evergreen trees. So there are differences, but overall, it's a mixed forest. And within that mixed forest, you're going to find all kinds of critters like raccoons and chipmunks and squirrels and foxes and bobcats and deer, different varieties of deer, etc. And that will go throughout most of these mixed forests. So what are we looking at? We're looking at this area over here and over here. So specifically right now, we are looking at the humid subtropical climate type, and that's the southeast portion of this particular biome here. Again, we're going to look and see that this biome extends beyond the boundaries of this climate type. But the humid subtropical would have this temperate mixed forest biome. West Virginia, spring, summer, getting into fall. In this case, we're going to see that most of these trees here are probably going to be deciduous with some evergreens. Depending on exactly where you are, the relative amount will change. Okay, our last sea climate type is the marine west coast. So we're looking at lower mid latitudes, even though that extends all the way to about 60 degrees here. We're looking at wet all year and either a pretty warm to hot summer or a much more mild summer. So you can imagine the CFCs are going to be a little bit further north in the northern hemisphere than the CFBs are. So these are areas that are pretty wet all year. So think about Seattle, Portland. You can go there any time of year. If you're there for a month, you'll probably get some rainfall. If you go to England, even in July, you'll probably get some rainfall. New Zealand, go to any time of year, probably going to get some rainfall. Not on any particular day, but if you're there long enough, for a month, you're definitely going to get some rainfall there. So these are places that it's going to have some moisture every single month. That also means they're pretty green places. So you think of Seattle, you go out to natural areas around there, it's going to be pretty green. Alaska, the same. Ireland, the same. England, the same. So mild, humid summers, cool, wet winters. Precipitation in all months. 30 to 50 inches of rainfall per year would be about 1.5 to 2.5 times the amount of rainfall we get in Glendale every single year. Now, there are going to be some regional differences too. If you're on the side of a hill facing the storms that come in, you're going to get more. And if you're on the other side of the slope, you're going to get a little bit less. So these are the places that are under the influence of the westerlies throughout the year. So remember, the westerlies and all of our pressure and wind belts, they migrate a little bit north in the northern hemisphere summer. They migrate a little bit further south in the northern hemisphere winter. But those westerlies will hit some places all year. And these marine west coast climate types are those that are hit by the westerlies throughout the year. So again, mild summers and winters are also pretty mild. So you think about Seattle. Seattle might get some snow in the winter, but the coastal influence means it's not going to get that cold, so you don't get that much snow. Same in England. You might get some snow, but not an awful lot of snow. Again, which biome? The temperate mixed forest biome. So we're going to sucker again. So if you went to the coast of Alaska, it would look a little bit like this. British Columbia, look a little bit like this. The coast of Washington State will look a little bit like this, with lots of trees, in this case mixed forest, but dominated by the evergreen trees. For Sitka, Alaska, way up here along this coastline, we see pretty cold temperatures, but not super cold, but pretty cold temperatures in winter and pretty mild temperatures in the summertime. Rainfall throughout the year, but if you don't like the rainfall, maybe the time to go will be late spring and early summer. That also means before the mosquitoes come out. You go there in July, August, lots of mosquitoes. So again, temperate mixed forest. This is what you get in the marine west coast climate type. Now, in some places, the natural vegetation has been completely cut down. In New Zealand, a lot of their native trees were cut down for not only lumber, but also for shipbuilding, and replaced with things like Douglas fir or various pines. So one species that does well in a climate type could do well in a far-flung corner of the world if it has that same climate type. And that's a little bit problematic if you're trying to regrow some of those old species of trees that were once cut down. Northern California, along the coast, we've got mixed forests. We've got some deciduous trees down here and some evergreen trees over here. And that's a pretty typical scene along the Northern California coast. Well, We've covered the A climates, the B climates, now the C climates. There's going to be a ton of questions, and I'm going to be throwing some questions at you in the coming days. But basically, as we meet, there's going to be time for you to ask questions of me. So enough for now. I'm going to log off, keep it under an hour, and say to you, thanks, hang in there, see you soon.